All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Returning to the show today is David Beito. David Beito is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Alabama and Senior Research Fellow at the Independent Institute. He is the author of many historical works, including the one we discussed last time I had him on the show, The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights. Today, we're going to be discussing his brand new book, FDR, A New Political Life, which looks at the life, the presidency, and the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the most notorious presidents in U.S. history. I'm really excited to talk about this. I love diving into American history on the show. So, David Beito, thank you so much again for coming on the show today.
No, I'm looking forward to it. I like the last interview.
So before we get into the book, just talk to us because, I was looking through this. It didn't seem like it was that long ago. But looking through my archives, it was like sorry, I'm losing my voice here. It was almost 2 years ago that you came on the show to discuss your book. So for my new listeners, tell us about yourself, your background, and the work that you do.
All right. Well, I'm been a professor of history at the University of Alabama for quite a while. I got my degree at PhD, University of Wisconsin. I've done a few different books on varied topics, including a book on mutual aid, from mutual aid to the welfare state, which is about how mutual aid organizations, fraternal societies provided social welfare before the rise of the welfare state. I did a book called Taxpayers in Revolt about tax resistance during the Great Depression. And I did a book on T.R.M. Howard, who was a civil rights figure that has been forgotten, but was quite prominent in his time. And that may lead to a biography of another book about the town where T.R.M. Howard really used as his platform, an all-black town in Mississippi. So those are some samplings of my research interests.
Yeah, the last book that you wrote, FDR's War, or the New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, was phenomenal. And I'll put links to that interview in the show notes for anyone that wants to go back and listen to that episode. I would highly recommend it. It's going to complement a lot of what we discuss here. But that one kind of focused more on the New Deal and the cultural context of that legislation in general, whereas your new book, FDR, A New Political Life, focuses specifically on President Roosevelt. So what made you want to write a biography about him specifically?
Well, I was offered a contract and I went into it and said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to have to cover a lot of issues that I didn't cover in this book. But as I looked more into it, I got more enthusiastic about the idea of writing a biography of FDR. And there really hasn't been one done for a long time that takes this kind of critical perspective. There's a lot of critical work on FDR, but I sort of bring a lot of that work together. And he's always been a fascinating figure to me. And I've always been a little leery of him. As a child, I saw a movie called Sunrise at Campobello, which was about Roosevelt's struggle against polio. And there was just something about, maybe it was about the actor who played him, that just came across as a little too slick and a little too forced in his manner. He's a very charming figure, but it always seemed to me somewhat like, what's behind that charm? And I think that this book looks at sort of what was the substance of FDR, the people that really knew him, that were really close to him, what really motivated him, what were his methods. And his methods were often behind the scenes. He's very different than Trump in that way.
Yeah.
You know where Trump is coming from, at least to some extent, right? He'll threaten people to take them off the air, right? He'll do it publicly. He'll threaten to use the FCC. Roosevelt would never do that publicly. However, privately, he was very effective in getting his critics silenced. By 1938, there's not a single anti-Roosevelt radio commentator on the major networks. Every one of them, even some very popular ones, have been forced off the air, but through quiet methods, where FDR would go to the sponsors, or he would use buffers, as they say in The Godfather, to go to sponsors to get people off the air. And he would have never given a speech like Trump gave. about Jimmy Kimmel, for example.
Yeah, and he is a fascinating figure, and I know we'll talk a little bit later in the show because I kind of want to set this up. As you know, being a history professor at a major university, Americans are by and large completely ignorant about our own history, and so FDR has this legacy where he's kind of beloved. I mean, even a lot of conservatives have a lot of respect for FDR. But as you're gonna make the case in your book, his legacy, the way that we've received him, does not align with his actual policies, and I really appreciate that you start from the beginning, trying to set him within his historical context, and not just in the broader context of kind of, the early 20th century, but his own personal context and the experiences that shaped and formed the man that he will become as a president. So I want to go through his life, and there's so many good anecdotes in your book that I know we're not going to be able to cover today, but I would just ask my audience to say everything you think you know about FDR, suspend that for the next 50 minutes and just listen to what we have to say here. So I want to start with Roosevelt's early personal life. What do we know about that and the impact that would have on the man that he became?
Well, he's born into wealth, not incredible wealth, but comfortable sort of aristocratic wealth. He goes to the very best schools, as someone in his class would have done in his background. He goes to Groton, he goes to Harvard, he goes to Columbia Law School. And a key figure in his life is someone he refers to as Uncle Ted, who is not technically his uncle. In fact, he's a very distant cousin. Theodore Roosevelt, who FDR very much admires and supports, even though, TR is a Republican and FDR comes from a family that's more democratic. That's his role model. And from an early stage, he sort of sets out to emulate that role model. He runs to the New York State Legislature. He wins. I mean, he lays it out. This is what I'm going to do. He's elected to the legislature. He ends up becoming, just like Uncle Ted, he ends up becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just like Uncle Ted. He runs for vice president, just like Uncle Ted. Now, there's where the difference is that Roosevelt lost when he ran for vice president in 1920, and Uncle Ted won. But there are some very close parallels between them. There are some very interesting differences as well. But that is a key role model for him. Now, as Assistant Secretary of Navy, even before that, he's quite close to Woodrow Wilson. He's a big Wilson supporter. Wilson and Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, don't get along very well, but they're both progressives. And they both have a lot of things in common, even though personally, they don't get along with each other. But Roosevelt, FDR, is somebody who gets along with both of these people. Both of these people are mentors to him. So he's very much in this progressive tradition. And he's a very charming man. He's well liked. When he's brought on as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, his boss, Josephus Daniels, says he was like an actress. He had it, right? He had that charm, and it was quite effective, and he used it quite effectively. He had an aristocratic manner. And this makes him different from Uncle Ted. Uncle Ted wanted to be a cowboy, a rough rider. He was a man's man. FDR, and if he wanted to be a man's man, he couldn't quite pull it off, right? He has a different. He embraces his aristocracy, and that makes him popular. I mean, I think part of the reason my parents liked him, I think there were other reasons. My parents were Roosevelt Democrats, is because there was sort of this feeling that this guy doesn't have to do this. He's serving the nation. He's this aristocrat. He could live in comfort, but here he is, providing leadership to the United States. It's a big secret. I think it's a big part of his success was that aristocratic manner that people found appealing, very poor people found appealing.
Yeah, and you already talked about how he is kind of like the progressive of progressives, and he's obviously a product of the progressive era in American history. So talk about that. What were some of the ideas that were swirling around at that time that would have appealed to an aristocratic progressive like FDR?
Okay, well, FDR is not an intellectual. He doesn't read a lot of books. People say that about Donald Trump. I would say FDR probably comes close to Trump. He reads newspapers, though, very aware of what they're saying. Um, so he's not a great intellectual, but at the same time, there are some historians who sort of say, well, he didn't care about ideas that much, right? Or he wasn't a consistent thinker. I think he was very influenced by these progressive ideas that are floating around. I think his default position was a progressive. Now, he's a politician, that comes first, but if he can get a progressive agenda enacted as he interprets it, he'll push for that. So one aspect of progressivism that is very influential is the question of means and ends. For a lot of progressives, their view is the ends are the important things. And why are you so worried, they would ask sometimes, about these things like this fossilized constitutional requirements, right? Precedents, all of this stuff. If you've got injustice, if you've got some goal you want to accomplish, you don't worry about how you achieve that goal. And that is Roosevelt. It's a consistent thread in his career. It's like, we've got to get this done. He's not going to worry about procedure. He might talk like he's worried, but that's not something he cares about particularly. So that's an element of progressivism that I could see. He doesn't trust businessmen. He doesn't trust the business class, sort of like an old aristocrat in some sense. He thinks he's smarter than they are. And he does make investments. Roosevelt makes a lot of investments. Most of them are failed investments. But he really comes at this thinking, I know more than these rich people do, right? I could do as well as they do. But he doesn't when he actually invests his own money. But he has that kind of attitude towards them.
Yeah. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap between his disposition and that of Woodrow Wilson, at least in the sense of having an almost quasi-messianic self-conception, the belief that they are right about everything and that they have a responsibility to impose it on society. And you already mentioned his relationship with Woodrow Wilson. And I know for like libertarian-leaning people, Woodrow Wilson and FDR are kind of like the two great bad guys of the early 20th century. And they're very tight with each other. So talk to us about the relationship that he had with Woodrow Wilson and how it influenced him.
I'm not sure they're that tight with each other, but he's definitely a supporter and admirer of Wilson. FDR would, I think, kind of exaggerate a little bit how close they were to each other, but he's definitely in that, in that tradition. I'm sorry, if you could repeat your question exactly, because I think I don't.
Yeah, just talk about talk about the influence that Wilson had on FDR.
Yeah. Well, one interesting similarity is that Wilson is a man who is very much promotes democratic rhetoric. Makes him different than a lot of previous presidents, where he'll say, in American foreign policy, we're doing this to, advance democracy, right? We're doing this to advance human rights. Elections. Wilson famously said, I'm going to teach the people of Latin America to elect good men, right? That's a very Wilsonian statement. So Roosevelt definitely has Wilsonian rhetoric. He does his famous speech, on the four freedoms, right? That he brings up as this is our foreign policy. So he picks up that. There's a lot of flowery rhetoric about we're going to advance the American constitutional ideas internationally, and we're going to even make it a little better and have new rights added, like freedom from want and freedom from fear. right? Which, of course, what do those rights mean exactly?
Right.
But Roosevelt's, it's sort of like he's adding to Wilsonianism in some sense. So I think rhetorically, there's similarities. I think there's a kind of cynicism about Roosevelt, though, that is not the case with Wilson as much. Wilson is not my favorite president, but I think that he really believes this stuff to a much greater extent than I think Roosevelt does. I mean, he has, Roosevelt's got a kind of cynical, jaded edge to him that Wilson doesn't have.
Yeah. Well, you get into a little bit of
and
that.
Also, I'd say Roosevelt's more pragmatic. He'll back off if he has to. And Wilson is not of that ilk.
Yeah, well, I guess in that sense, I mean, we've kind of been drawing some of the comparisons between Donald Trump and FDR, and Donald Trump being a media personality, he does have at least a little bit of a sense of how the decisions that he makes in office are going to affect his public perception. And it seems like FDR has some of that as well.
Oh, yeah. He's very attuned to the public perception of him. He reads newspapers. I didn't read a lot, but he read newspapers. And he was aware when he was being criticized, and he would read the critical press as well as the positive press. And if the positive press, I mean, there were New Deal newspaper people, and Roosevelt would get very worried once they started to criticize him on particular points. So he's very attuned to that, very attuned to public opinion. But if he really wanted something, he could kind of try to mold public opinion, and Japanese internment would be kind of an example of that, I think.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of his civil rights abuses in just a few minutes, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the New Deal, because that is really important. Sure. In a lot of ways. It encapsulates the ethos that he brought with him to the presidency. So you have a section in your book where you talk about the policy mistakes that FDR makes when implementing the New Deal, particularly as it relates to property rights. And I want to talk to you about how he kind of puts the New Deal into practice in ways that are constitutionally dubious. But maybe first, if you could just kind of, for my audience who maybe kind of vaguely remembers this from history class, what was the New Deal? And how was that one of the defining domestic policies of FDR's presidency?
Okay. Well, FDR, the history of this is FDR used the term the New Deal for the first time in his, I think it was in his acceptance speech when he accepted the Democratic nomination. I believe I'm right about that. And it was a term that came from an article in the New Republic by a guy named Stuart Chase. And Stuart Chase is in that article talks about how great the Soviet Union is, and how we should emulate them and all of this. And, is that why FDR embrace that term? I don't necessarily think so. In fact, if you look at what he said during the 1932 campaign about the New Deal, there's no hint, very little of a hint of what actually was the New Deal. FDR, some of his speeches sound like they could have been given by Ronald Reagan or Ron Paul even. I mean, they're very much, we got to cut the government spending and 25% and balance the budget, and we don't want big government running things. But he also said things during that campaign which were very vague. Well, we got to do something about unemployment. It was very general, but there's no hint. So when voters, really where he's going. So when voters elected FDR, they were not voting for what we call the New Deal. That's one thing that we have to get out of the way. And I think a lot of historians sort of assume that his victory was a mandate for what he ended up doing. Not really, because it's not really, he runs a standard political platform, Democratic platform in many ways in 1932. So he's elected, and very immediately, as the economy sort of crashing down during this critical period after the election, which lasts for an incredible amount of time, because the new president doesn't take office till March, and the election is November. So you have this long period some people called it the interregnum of despair, where the banks are going belly up. And FDR tells his advisors, well, let the banks fail. I mean, President Hoover tries to cooperate with Roosevelt to give some reassurance and possibly do something like a bank holiday or something like that. And Roosevelt refuses. He also refuses to do something that could have maybe saved the banking system without a bank holiday, and that is allowing American banks to branch across state lines like they had in Canada. Canada didn't have a single banking failure during the Great Depression, even though it's very much like the United States experience. It didn't have a single bank failure. Why? Because they allowed banks to branch, and therefore you might have a weak rural bank that would go under. Well, so what? One branch goes under, or the other branches essentially support it, right? Because you have a national banking system. He wouldn't allow that. Hoover didn't either, but there were proposals to do that. So anyway, what FDR does, long story here, is he begins the New Deal at the beginning of his administration. He begins the banking holiday, closing all the banks and then allowing them to reopen when their assets are found stable. But then he brings in, which wasn't that controversial, but then he brings in a lot of other things like the National Recovery Administration, which is the closest I think we've ever come to kind of a fascist, economic fascism, right? Where you have wage and price controls over the smallest details, right? You set up essentially big business working with big labor, although business is really in charge, can regulate its own industry, can quash its own competition, right? People go to jail for working under, for charging prices that are considered too low, right? Because it's trying to force up prices, or paying workers, even though those workers are consenting, wages that are considered too low. And so it's an attempt to force up prices and wages. They do the same thing with agriculture, putting in agricultural subsidies, forcing farmers to destroy, giving them basically, an offer they can't refuse, to plow under certain fields, to kill piglets, to slaughter livestock, and all part of this goal of raising prices, of limiting supply. Massive intervention in the American economy compared to what had come before, in many ways compared to what came later. So those are examples. You have things like rural electrification, where the government is going to go in and essentially try to produce power. In effect, the government is going in there and is sort of undermining the private sector production of power, for rural residents, but also undermining, the ability of people to live off the grid. And that is an interesting story that's not often told. A lot of people were using things like they had their own generators, they had solar power, they had wind power, they had these decentralized electrical generators. And but FDR's rural electrification essentially undermined all of that and really didn't speed up very much the electrification of rural areas. Some very good research on that recently that has found that the private sector was doing a very good job electrifying rural areas, and would have essentially completed the job by the 1940s had it just been left to, do its thing. Of course, later we get Social Security in the second New Deal. There's the first New Deal, and then FDR does the second New Deal, which includes Social Security as one of the big parts of the second New Deal, which comes in 1935.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that as well. What's the value, or maybe not even the value? We in your book you argue that we have to think about the New Deal in terms of two phases, the first and the second New Deal. What distinguishes those two phases of FDR's New Deal policy program?
there's been a big debate about that. Some historians have traditionally said, well, the first New Deal was recovery, and the second New Deal was long-term reform, right? Long-term, whatever, change. There's something to that, but I wouldn't go too far with that, because FDR ended up really liking the NRA so much that he wanted to keep it. I don't know, would he have ever shut it down? I think he intended to keep it. So I'm not sure that distinction really works. I think in some sense, the first New Deal is concerned with the regulatory state to a great extent. And it's not completely true, but the second New Deal is more concerned with erecting the welfare state. I think that's probably a very rough distinction between them that I'd make. And it's certainly the big part of the welfare state that you're seeing in the second New Deal is Social Security, but you're also seeing the beginnings of what ultimately today is the SNAP program. You're seeing the beginnings of that federalization really take off in that second New Deal period. And you also got public works programs during the second New Deal, like the WPA coming in as well, which really, I think, functions on the ground kind of as an electoral, a method to win elections, right?
Yeah.
Because what you would do is during off years, you'd cut back on things like the WPA and a lot of these welfare programs as well. But during election years, you'd ramp up. It's called the political economic cycle. Political scientists have called that. And FDR is very good at that, at using government money and benefits during crucial periods, electoral periods, to target them to specific states. One part of the region doesn't get much, and that's the South. And the reason is because he has it locked in. The states that really get that money, that support, are places like New Jersey, which used to be a swing state, and Pennsylvania, which was a swing state. And they get all kinds of money and resources during elections, because that's one way you win. He identifies particular congressmen, senators, states that we have a chance here if we pour in some resources. And it's done quite effectively.
And he really is the first president in U.S. history that targets federal programs to particular groups of the electorate, right?
Well, they might have some before, but he certainly professionalizes it, makes it into a science, and he combines it with scientific polling, which is pretty sophisticated polling. He brings on some guy named Emil Herja, who's just father of modern scientific polling. Brings these people in and puts them to work and saying, I want you to go down to the local level and identify which areas we need to pour money into, which areas we don't need to bother with. And even, in 36, 2 states go Republican. But even if you look at those states, Maine and Vermont, the counties in Maine and Vermont that received the most New Deal money went for Roosevelt. And you see the reverse. There were a lot of states like Pennsylvania and so forth, where those areas that didn't get as much of the New Deal money went for the Republicans. So I think even in 36, now, would he won that election anyway? Probably. But there's more to that election than a lot of people think. And a lot of it is strategic dispersal of public resources, but it's often forgotten in that election, which is the biggest landslide in American history, that FDR was actually losing in the most respected polls in the summer. Now there's a famous poll that people cite that showed Landon winning, which nobody took seriously at the time. Nobody who knew about polling took seriously. But the actual professional polls do show Roosevelt in trouble early on. But then a lot of things end up going in his favor. But that's one of them.
Yeah, and I like the way that you phrased it in your book. You talk about how the New Deal really does change the character of America, and there's this myth that if it wasn't for the New Deal, then we never would have come out of the Great Depression. But as you address in the book, the Great Depression lasted a really long time, and it didn't seem like these policies helped. And in fact, a lot of these policies probably prevented the New Deal from ending much earlier than it actually did. And so I want to talk about, I guess, the legacy of the New Deal. How did this change the character of the United States, and why do so many people defend it when it would just appear on the face of it historically that it didn't work?
I always ask people to do a comparison. There was a severe recession, which was as bad as the first, I guess, about the first 2 years of the Great Depression in 1920, 21, 22, under Harding. When Harding takes off, it's kind of after, World War I, is the kind of a readjustment is set in. Unemployment skyrockets. All these things happen. Harding's response to that is let wages fall, let prices fall, let the economy readjust. He doesn't go in and try to prop up wages and prices, as Hoover tried to do and Roosevelt tried to do. He lets the process play out. It's over with. Third year, it's over with, right? What happens in the Great Depression, even though the beginning is not as severe, it goes on and on and on. It lasts over a decade, longest in American history, and it was needless, right? But you still have the same agenda where Hoover goes in there. He's trying to prop up wages. Hoover had this idea that if people were paid more, they'd consume more, and you get economic recovery. Roosevelt has kind of the same idea, but he even takes it farther, and it doesn't work, right? Because what employers do, if they're going to not fire people, they're not going to, if they're going to give everybody wage increases or not cut their wages, they're going to save on payroll by laying off workers. And that's exactly what they do. All right. So the legacy of the New Deal is you bring in this effort sold to some extent as temporary. I don't think Roosevelt intended it to be temporary, but sold that way, and it just persists, right? A lot of this ends up persisting. Rural electrification, Social Security. Of course, that is intended to be permanent. But you get these big changes occurring in American society during a very short period, and they last and they continue because you get a constituency. It's like now, there's a real concern. So many people are dependent on SNAP. What's going to happen if it's cut off, right? People are going to be mad about that. Well, once you get these programs in place, it's very hard to turn back anymore.
Yeah, no, that's completely true. And you do such a great job of highlighting the failures of the New Deal in your book. You almost could have ended it on that, and it would have made for a great read. But FDR's actual record on issues that many people today care about is much, much worse than the New Deal. And I remember reading through your book on The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights. You have a chapter in that book about the treatment of Black Republicans in the South by the Democratic political establishment, and it is an insane and completely untold story chapter in American history of how there was this massive racial discrimination by people that were associated with FDR against Blacks for the sake of not sharing the same political values as them. And we just don't talk about that at all. And one of the things that you bring out in your book, we all know about the internment camps, and people rationalize that by saying, well, World War II is the worst war in human history. Bad things happen on both sides, so we have to let that go. Okay. But his record wasn't just bad with the Japanese interns. It's his record on minorities is much worse than that. So talk to us about FDR's treatment of minorities throughout his public career.
Oh God, that's a big one. But I mean, there's a lot there. All right. Well, during World War I, Woodrow Wilson brings in segregation, and FDR's boss brings in segregation into the federal government in a massive way for the first time. FDR he doesn't have any problem with that. In fact, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he helps, he helps carry it out. Things like discharging all black workers from the Department of Navy, other than maybe some menial workers, instituting restroom segregation, right, for the first time. All of this, FDR has no big problem with that. When riots occur, race riots occur, because African Americans are literally just attacked by these white sailors. Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he kind of jokes around about that. He writes to a friend from lived in the South, said, well, we need some of you people here. Maybe you can teach us how to handle problems like this, right?
Man.
Things like that. FDR is elected in 1932, and he only gets about 20% of the black vote. So even in the worst year of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who carries the black vote, because a lot of people remembered about this. However, it changes, and FDR makes inroads. But it's something of a question as to why he's making those inroads, because he doesn't do anything for African Americans. No civil rights legislation, nothing. Now, the big effort that's being pushed by groups like the NAACP is for federal anti-lynching law, because there have been some horrific lynchings. And the Republicans had traditionally supported those. In fact, the House had passed an anti-lynching law, but had been stopped in the Senate. FDR, every year, people in the NAACP go to him and beg him, could you push for an anti-lynching bill? And he says, well, maybe next year. And then finally, in 1937, there's such public outrage that he can really get it. Even a lot of the Southerners are pushing for it. And he does maybe next year, because what is his priority? His priority is packing the court, not anything like this. So that is his priority. And then during World War II, we have all sorts of interesting things happen. Like you mentioned, there was black Republicans in the South. Most of the South, blacks couldn't vote anymore. However, there were exceptions. One of them was Memphis, where a lot of blacks still voted. And you had a strong Republican Party. The leadership of the Republican Party were African Americans. There was a guy named J.B. Martin. He was the head of the National Negro Baseball League. He was a prominent black entrepreneur, and he thinks he can carry the state for the Republican in 1940. A close ally of Roosevelt, who's mayor of Memphis, finds out about this and said, I hear you're going to schedule a big rally of over 1,000 people. He'd already done one of over 1,000, multiracial, right? Tennessee had actually gone Republican in the 1920s. So, and Crump, the mayor, just tells this guy, so you call that rally off or I'll police you. And the guy refuses. And so what ends up happening is, Crump sent the police to this guy's drugstore, the leading black drugstore in the South, searches every customer, including school children, priests, whites, blacks, everyone going into the drugstore, searches them. And, wages war. It's clear he's going to try to put this guy in jail, in the workhouse. And the guy knows it's going to happen. And Martin knows, and he leaves the city. He complains to the Civil Rights Division in the federal government. It's such an obvious case. Even some of the local papers in Memphis see it as obvious. You can't do this to somebody. And what does the Justice Department do? It looks like they were probably willing to prosecute Crump, but it's called off from the top. No prosecution occurs. A. Philip Randolph, the famous African American leader, goes to Memphis, fights for free speech there, goes to his friend Eleanor Roosevelt and said, please, you need to speak out on this. And Eleanor delays and finally writes him back, said, I've been advised it is not a good idea for me to speak out on this, and nothing happens. So I could go on, but those are some examples. And you can see a lot of censorship of the black press during the war as well.
Yeah, and he wasn't just bad on free speech. He was very much opposed to it. So talk about his legacy of free speech, and really we can't talk about his legacy of free speech. Talk about his regime of censorship, because that's what he did.
All right, as I said, Roosevelt would do it from behind the scenes very often. Forrest Boak Carter, the leading anti-New Deal radio commentator, off the air by going to Marjorie Merriweather Post, prominent Democratic donor, original owner of Mar-a-Lago, small world. And she, uses influence to force Carter off the air. And he has IRS investigate him, and the immigration department goes all out quietly behind the scenes. So he does that kind of thing. During World War II, there is FDR really wants to go after the big metropolitan newspapers that have millions of subscribers, because most of the print press is anti-New Deal. So there are papers like the Chicago Daily Tribune, anti-New Deal, New York Daily News, anti-New Deal, and Washington Times Herald, I think it's Times Herald. But anyway, it's the so-called McCormick-Patterson axis. They're related to each other. They're very anti-New Deal. And anti-Roosevelt, really, not anti-New Deal as much. And he wants to go after him. He wants to prosecute these people because they had opposed him before Pearl Harbor. They were non-interventionists. However, when Pearl Harbor occurs, they say, we support the president. We're in this war now. They back the war effort. But Roosevelt wants to go after them for their pre-war activities. His attorney general is a guy that is a pretty civil libertarian guy in a lot of ways, named Francis Biddle. And Biddle just says, look, we don't have a case, right? A lot of the people in the Justice Department agree with Biddle. A lot of juries agree with Biddle. So it's a very interesting situation where if Roosevelt had his way, he would have put those people in jail. However, he's getting resistance from the deep state. And this is in some sense, I think, a positive deep state, right? Where over the years, because of the memories of World War I, of prohibition abuses, there is a civil libertarian consciousness that has creeped in, seeped in, even among a lot of New Dealers, and they're going to push back. Under Wilson, it's sometimes the reverse. Wilson sometimes, his subordinates want to go after people, and they go to the president, and the president says, well, do you really have to do this? All right. He'll defer to them, right? Roosevelt's the opposite. He's going to subordinates and saying, I want this person prosecuted. Go after them. He wanted to intern the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, take them on to the small islands and transport them there. During Midway, take some transport ships, put them there. Anyway, he wanted to do that, but people resisted on the ground. So that's part of the story, that there is civil libertarian consciousness on the left and the right, and they often come together and push back successfully. So it's sort of an interesting story there, where I think Roosevelt would have gone a lot farther if he could have. But there's no opposition to the war. It's not like World War I. Once Pearl Harbor happens, just about everybody is supporting the war effort. So there isn't the same kind of opposition. So there isn't the same kind of legal pretext to go after people because they happen to oppose Roosevelt in November 1941 on foreign policy.
Yeah. And that's a great segue to my next question. This is where I think we have to slaughter a sacred cow. FDR, also universally recognized as a presidential wartime hero. He's the one that led the United States through the greatest war in human history and led us to victory on both fronts. But you argue that he's not really the hero that he's often made out to be. So talk about his mixed legacy during World War II as the commander-in-chief of the United States forces.
Okay. FDR's views on foreign policy are he comes out of the Wilsonian tradition, right? So he's sort of a Wilsonian, but he's also a politician seeking votes. So, for example, during the 1930s, there is legislation put on the books called the Neutrality Act. Roosevelt, it's sort of his brainchild. He's the guy that kind of pushes it in the first place. He later distanced himself, but he recognizes that Americans don't want another war, right? They remember World War I. There's all this stuff out there, culturally, the movies. Boy, that was a mistake. They don't want to do it again. And so he latches on to that. The Munich Agreement. Roosevelt's initial response to that is he writes Chamberlain and he says, good man, right? He even tries to take credit for the Munich Agreement, saying, well, we had some role in this, but then he turns against he turns against Germany, Hitler, and by 40, certainly 41, Roosevelt is trying to get us in the war. His methods are not always above board. Again, the focus is mainly on Europe, not Asia. But there are all these incidents in the North Atlantic. And Roosevelt is trying to provoke an incident with Hitler. And Hitler, has got his hands full, so he's avoiding trouble in the North Atlantic. But Roosevelt keeps seeing these incidents like the Greer incident, the Turner Joy, and he's saying, basically, a cause celeb, and people aren't buying it because there's still a lot of there's a willingness. Most people are willing to say we need to help the British out, right? But after the Battle of Britain, sort of successful, there isn't the same urgency as there had been before. People are willing to help the British, but they're reluctant to get into the war. And Roosevelt is searching for some sort of cause celeb, which ends up happening in the Pacific, not the Atlantic. And that's sort of a separate story there. But what happens is Roosevelt puts a lot of emphasis on the North Atlantic, getting in the war against Germany. That really, one of the stories here is that the American defenses in the Pacific are kind of starved. They wanted to, for example, observation planes, which might have come in quite handy. In December 1941, they cut back on observation planes because the priority is putting resources into the North Atlantic.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And, there's so much in the book where you talk about his record during World War II. We could talk about the internment camps, which we get into on the last time I interviewed you. We have about, 12 or 13 minutes left. And I really do want to focus on the way that FDR's presidency forever altered the course of American history. He's the only president in U.S. history to win 4 elections. So he serves longer than anyone else. And I don't think there's any doubt that he had a massive impact on the way that the United States would develop after the 1940s. One of the areas that you identify in your book is the expansion of executive power. And we're almost numb to it in the 21st century. We're used to presidents issuing executive orders. We're used to having an expansive executive branch that makes a lot of decisions apart from Congress and the judiciary. And a lot of this can be traced back to FDR himself. So how did FDR's expansion of the executive branch set the stage for future presidents?
Well, FDR is the first, I don't know if he's the first, but he perfects it. I guess what Arthur Schlesinger called, who was an admirer of FDR actually, but he would have agreed with me on this, the first to be an example of the imperial presidency.
Yeah.
The whole view that, we should stop debate if it involves something in foreign policy. We should, these political debates should stop at the border, right? And we should all be together to pursue a bipartisan foreign policy. That's something really that FDR is able to create during the period after Pearl Harbor, and that persists. The national security state is certainly something that he's created. What later becomes the CIA, the FBI is very much empowered. And one of the things I talked about in the book is we have some pioneering work done by really in cooperation with FDR. U.S. Senate committee called the Black Committee surveils millions of private telegrams. It's just unprecedented. So in a lot of ways, what we see today with surveillance of social media on a massive scale, really, we see precedents for that under the New Deal period. Certainly, the warfare state, the regulatory state, the imperial presidency. We could go on and on with examples. FDR wages a war on drugs, right? Once we get the end of prohibition, which again, that wasn't something that was his issue. He latched onto it and he embraced it during the campaign, and we did end prohibition. So I guess we could give FDR that. We can give FDR that. But then the war on drugs in many ways is ramped up under Roosevelt as well. So that occurs during his administration. So that's another legacy. So a lot of these things, and this whole idea of the ends are more important than the means. I think you see Donald Trump really being an example of that.
Yeah. Yes.
And Trump is like a bull in a china shop, but really he's got a similar mindset in many ways, right? Is get the job done, right? Blow up some ships. Well, he'll do it openly, and he won't worry. But there's a similarity there.
Yeah. Well, I think the final set of questions I want to put to you has to do with the way that Americans perceive FDR, which we've obviously talked about a couple of times on the show already. But FDR is widely respected by the American public. Even if conservatives don't like his economic policies in the New Deal, they still respect him as a valiant military leader. And so he has this very widespread popular positive perception by many Americans. And that's just not true. I think for me, especially after reading your book and the previous book, it's hard for me to see now. And I know the Democratic Party of today and, kind of the American left, they've pretty much compromised all of their principles. And so is the Republican Party. I'm not blaming it on one side or the other. But if you look at what left wingers say that they care about, things like being skeptical towards war, things like, obviously not oppressing minorities. Why is it that so many people are willing to overlook the negative aspects of FDR's record? And then what can we do to try to set this straight? How can we help people better understand who he was as a historical figure and maybe have a more reasonable assessment of his presidency? And I think about this too, just, a few years ago, it was very popular for people on the left to want to tear down every statue of every founding father that ever owned slaves, but they still love FDR despite his very clear abuse of minorities and other people that are a part of, their protected, oppressed classes. So where does all this come from, and how do we reach out to the American public and tell them that they might need to reevaluate their understanding of FDR?
Now is the time. FDR's reputation is still strong on the left, but it's kind of running on fumes. I think it's a little like Wilson, right? I don't know, 12 years ago, Wilson was ranked as one of the greats.
Yeah.
No, I don't know how he's ranked now, but he's certainly in trouble, his reputation. And, if you ever get in a discussion with somebody about Japanese internment who's a leftist, they're immediately on the defensive, but they still try to kind of defend him, say, well, he was a creature of his time, public opinion. I think all those arguments can be knocked down. He was the great decider when it came to this. He didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
But they tend to leave him off the hook. Anti-lynching, that's another example. I bring that up to leftists, and what they'll say is, well, he had to get the New Deal. I don't think that's a very good argument, but let's assume let's take it as an argument. The South was in FDR's pocket And there was majority of Southern whites thought something should be done about lynching too.
Yeah.
So those are two excuses you can shoot down. Once you shoot down those excuses, you could start looking at other things. Like, why did the Great Depression take so long? Why did recovery take so long? And you can give, what about, a lot of people on the left love the idea of living off the grid, of solar power, of wind power. Well, FDR played a central role in undermining those alternatives. What about that? And you can go on and on and on and give examples like that. And once you come up with specifics, present it to people. Say, okay, what's your response to this? And eventually that statue, so to speak, his reputation is eventually can't survive it overall. So I think we're at a very crucial time. But Americans want heroes. People on the left want heroes. Conservatives want heroes. And he is still the hero, but he's very much got feet of clay. And there are ways, there's so many examples of it, it's ridiculous. And so I think just now's the time to start pointing these things out, because I think you're going to be able to go, quite effective and not going to get a good response on a lot of these issues if you raise them.
Yeah. Well, as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to encourage everyone in my audience to pick up a copy of the book. Again, it's FDR, A New Political Life. It is an incredible book. Not extremely long. I know some biographies can go on and on and on. This one is very concise and succinct and gets right to the heart of the matter. And you will walk away from the book understanding FDR on a level that you never did before. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking with me about this. Before I let you go, where can people find this book and your other work as well?
Well, they can, it's being published by Karis Books, but you can find it. You can find all my work, on Amazon, Amazon, FDR, New Political Life is the latest one. The one I did a couple of years ago is the New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights. And they're all there and they're affordable. And I'll say one thing, the book is short. And when I looked at it, when I found the guy, I said, boy, it's a pretty short book. And then I thought, I said what I really needed to say for the most part. I think it's well researched. It's short. It's got a lot of topic headings. And I think it's a kind of book that potentially could be assigned. And, I don't know if people assign books anymore in courses. I've been retired for a couple of years. But, I think it would be a good book to say somebody's a big FDR historian who loves FDR. And they want to have one critical perspective. It would be a book that wouldn't take a lot of time to read. And I think it'll provide a lot of, a different perspective, perhaps, for debate. And I would love people on the left. I would love people at the FDR library. I would love to engage with FDR admirers. I really want that. And let's go at it and let's have that discussion. Because we're so divided now into our little, our little blue and red teams. Why, we need to think of ways to have discussions, and this could be a lively discussion across left and right. Maybe I'm wrong about FDR. Well, let's look at it. Maybe my sources are completely mistaken. Tear me apart. Order the book. Or ask me for a copy, and we can have a discussion about that.
I will put links to all of this in the show notes. Please go and buy yourself a copy of the book. David Beito, as always, it's great talking with you today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.